Thank you for joining us today. It is our third of 6 sessions for the 2025 Spring Heifer Academy webinar series. And today we have Catie Cramer with us, and we worked together a little bit at Colorado State. And so I'm super honored that she was able to take some time out of her very busy schedule to join us today and share her passions and what she's really curious and interested about with her research and also her pursuits. Before I roll into her introduction, I will just go through a couple of housekeeping things for the webinar today. So, as it says here, Catie is going to share with us on calf transportation, and there may be some poll questions. So, we are going to actually have a couple open-ended questions. So, we would really appreciate your interaction with that and filling that out if you're able to. And you can place questions in the Q&A section. We will be saving those questions for the end just to be sensitive of time. A live recording of the session will be available on the Heifer Academy YouTube playlist, and the audio will also be available on our Spotify playlist. As we're rolling through the questions at the end, please take some time to complete the post-session survey to provide both of us with valuable feedback on your thoughts of the session. If there's any future topics or talks you want coming out of this session, we'd love to hear that, and we would love to help make that happen for y'all. So to introduce Catie, I'm excited to bring a guest who brings both deep expertise and practical insight to a topic that is top of mind for many livestock professionals, calf transportation. So joining us today is Dr. Catie Cramer, assistant professor at Colorado State University, whose research is making a meaningful impact on both calf health and welfare. Her work focuses on two of the most critical stress points in young calf development: transportation and respiratory disease. Through her research, she's exploring how we can better understand and reduce the risks calves face during and after transport, times when they're especially vulnerable to illness, injury, and long-term health impacts. Her work doesn't stop at identifying the challenges. Dr. Cramer is also developing practical, evidence-based solutions that producers and veterinarians can apply to improve outcomes. From investigating the early signs and risk factors for bovine respiratory disease, also known as BRD, to testing interventions that support calf resilience during transport, her insights are helping move the industry forward. Whether you're a producer, veterinarian, transporter, or simply someone invested in the well-being of young stock, today's session will offer valuable insights that you can take back to your operation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Catie Cramer.
Thank you, Cora, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm very excited to be here with you today. And it's also really wonderful to see you doing so great and being so impactful in your career post-graduate school. All right, everything good?
Yep, it's showing up perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So Cora did a great job introducing that and kind of sharing what my research focuses on. And so today we'll talk really about 4 questions that I hope to provide some answers to. The first is transportation a bottleneck to success in calf programs? How does management influence calf welfare at each stage of transport? How can we minimize transportation stress? And then what do we need to consider about the supply chain? You'll notice that a lot of the information that we have for calf transport is actually out of Canada. That's who's really done the most work in this space, but we've definitely started doing some of that here in the US. And the other thing I want to mention is that this is Heifer Academy, right? But a lot of the data I'm going to share is about transportation of our non-replacement calves. And so I think, we recognize that there's some management differences between those classes of animals, but I think we can still definitely pull from data that we have to make sure that we're really setting our heifers up for success. So in the US, there's approximately 9.5 million calves born annually. So our replacement heifers and our non-replacements. And sometimes you might have heard those called surplus calves. I really prefer the term non-replacements. So for our replacement calves, we know that about 43% of those calves are raised off-site, and they're transported at about 3 days of age. And 15% of operations transport calves more than 50 miles. I'll point out that this data is from the USDA, and this study was really done, this data was collected over 10 years ago. So we really, from a national level, don't have more recent information, but this is what we know so far. And we know that most of our replacement calves are going to go directly from the dairy to their final destination. Although many might go through like a depot or assembly facility so that they can get a full load of trailer before transporting those calves long distances. I am going to talk about our non-replacement calves because if we're shipping heifer calves, we're most likely shipping non-replacement calves. And we've got to make sure that we're managing all of those animals well to set them all up for success. So male dairy calves have historically had low value. So if we think about our male Holstein calves, although that's certainly not the case right now and hasn't been the case for a year or so, but because of that historical low value, sometimes we have seen those calves not be managed to the level of replacement heifers. And then, of course, with the increased popularity of beef on dairy, those are our non-replacement calves as well. And so really we're seeing millions of calves transported in the US every year. We know from a national level that about 80% of those non-replacements are going to be transported off-site at less than a week of age. And we did some work here in the Western US and found that 64% of those calves actually leave the dairy at less than 24 hours of age. And those calves, they might go directly from the dairy to their destination. That is probably more common out here in the Western US. But many of them, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast, are going to go through, they're going to be transported, go through an auction or marketing facility, transported again, and then finally to their destination. And so here's the first poll question, and that is, what are your goals for your calf program? And then a follow-up to that is, what gets in the way of meeting those goals? And so I'd love for you to just share briefly some ideas with that. And then Cora, if you don't mind just sharing those out. And so hopefully many of you have had at least a chance to jot something down in there.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cora.
Okay, perfect. All right. So goals, let's see. Oh boy, for some reason, it's making me sign off for, I don't know why, but
Really? Okay. We can maybe
okay.
come back to those.
Yes, let's do that.
Okay, super. So I think, oftentimes what I hear from producers and when we think about raising calves, we want those animals to be healthy, productive, profitable, and live a comfortable and good life. And so oftentimes things like disease or severe weather conditions or human error, for example, can get in the way of that. And so the reason I kind of ask that is to get us thinking about, if our goal is to raise healthy, productive, profitable animals with good welfare, we have to minimize early life stress. And so today I'm going to share data that demonstrates that transportation is stressful for young calves. It's been well documented in our older animals, but it's especially hard on young calves. And so when those young animals are stressed, that makes them more susceptible to disease. And when calves are sick, they have reduced performance and reduced welfare. And because of that, transportation can be a bottleneck to success in calf raising. And so excellent management is critical, and it is going to determine if our calves are successful or not. So I'll use the term welfare a lot today, and I just want to provide a definition for that so we're all on the same page. So, the World Organization for Animal Health says that an animal experiences good welfare when it's healthy, comfortable, well nourished, safe, and not experiencing things like pain, fear, and distress. And they can express behaviors that are important or to their physical and mental health. And so I provide that one, so we kind of have a common definition, but two, because a lot of the data that I show will demonstrate that transportation can negatively impact animal welfare in a variety of different ways. Keep in mind, I said that many of these calves are leaving the dairy at less than a week of age, sometimes less than 24 hours of age. And so those young calves are highly susceptible to stress and disease. And one of the reasons our calves are susceptible to disease is because for the first few weeks of life, they rely fully on maternal antibodies from colostrum to help them fight disease. And so this graph is a conceptual figure that's been adapted, that I adapted from some publications. And so along the x-axis is the age of the calf in days, and along the y-axis is the level of antibodies. And so you can see that maternal antibodies really increase around, they reach their peak around 3 to 4 days of age. And then they start dropping off, thereafter. And the calf doesn't really begin to develop their own antibodies to pathogens that they encounter until 2 to 3 weeks of life. And so because of the way that immune system develops, calves have a window of susceptibility typically around 2 to 3 weeks of age, which is when those antibodies from colostrum are decreasing and that calf is just beginning to have its own immune response. And the length and timing of this window is going to be highly dependent on the level of maternal antibodies the calf got from colostrum. And so if we have excellent passive transfer or transfer of passive immunity, that's what TPI stands for, we have a slightly shorter window of susceptibility, and those antibodies from colostrum are going to offer protection for that calf for longer. However, when we don't do a good job of providing excellent colostrum, that window of susceptibility becomes longer and can occur earlier. And so this window is influenced by how things go really for the first couple days of life for that calf. And so this idea really highlights why it can potentially be challenging to transport calves at this very young age. We're heavily relying on colostrum to help that calf fight disease, and so any stress we add increases that calf susceptibility. When we think about the stressors associated with transportation and what that means for the calf, we know that calves who are transported are going to be commingled. Oftentimes, they may experience extreme weather conditions, improper handling if they're not handled correctly. They might have a lack of bedding on that trailer. They might be exposed to pathogens, and they often don't have access to milk or water on the trailer, and even times during marketing as well. And so what that means for the calf is dehydration, discomfort, disease, energy depletion, fear, hunger, injury, thermal stress, and thirst. And we also know that stress makes an animal more susceptible to disease. So I just mentioned all the stressor types that can occur during transportation. While thermal stress, so exposure to weather extremes, nutritional stress, when those calves don't have access to milk, and commingling have all been documented to make that calf more likely to become sick. And when we think about our the productive raising productive animals, one of the things we often focus on in our calf programs is growth. And we know that disease negatively impacts average daily gain. And so depending on the study and the disease and the severity, we can see that average daily gain losses of anywhere from 0.01 to 1.7 pounds per day. And when we think about our replacement heifers and wanting them to go on to live a productive life later on, we know that pre-weaned average daily gain drives future milk production. And for every 1 pound decrease in pre-weaned average daily gain, first lactation milk yield decreases by 1,100 pounds. So with the current price of milk, that if an animal loses that 1 pound of pre-weaned average daily gain, you're losing $215 just on milk loss alone. It doesn't account for any of the other costs associated with disease. When we think about our non-replacement animals who are entering the beef or the veal supply chain, we know that calf hood disease and poor growth can reduce carcass quality. Those animals have a lower hot carcass weight, a lower price at auction. And we also know that disease can increase the risk for additional diseases, labor costs, the risk of death in those calves, and treatment costs as well. And so if we want our calf programs to be profitable and we want those animals to be productive in life, we have to consider how we manage early life stressors, such as transportation, because of this link between stress, calf performance, and calf welfare. So now we're going to go through each stage of transport, and I'll share the data we have at each of those stages that highlight some potential welfare challenges. And so the source dairy really prepares the calf for transport. We can decide at the dairy, are we going to set calves up for success or failure based on how we manage them? Primarily, the things we want to focus on here are colostrum and fitness for transport. We talk a lot about fitness for transport in our market cows. We have to start talking about it in calves, and we have to start managing it so that we're only shipping fit calves. And so going to talk briefly about, or first about colostrum. And so remember I mentioned that male dairy calves had historically had a lower value. And because of that, they historically have experienced things like contaminated colostrum, delayed colostrum feedings, and a lower total volume of colostrum. And when we look at the percentage of calves with failed transfer of passive immunity, so they didn't get adequate colostrum, a Canadian study found that on average, about 12% of calves had that, but it could be as high as 50%. And a US study found that 23% of calves had failed transfer of passive immunity. I want to point out, though, that the cut points used in these studies are lower than what we would consider excellent. So if we had looked at how many calves have excellent passive transfer, it would have been a much larger proportion of animals. And remember, we're trying to achieve excellent passive transfer to ensure that our window of susceptibility is shorter and later. This is a study that we did here at CSU, and we did a survey, a national survey on calf transport, and we asked dairies, calf raisers, and transporters about a variety of questions related to calf transportation. And we specifically were interested in differences between replacement heifers, beef on dairy, and dairy bull calves. And so this graph is showing the overall distribution of colostrum timing based on class of animal. When we look at it within operation, there were more operations that fed colostrum earlier to replacements than non-replacements. So again, even though we're seeing those animals increase in value, we do still see a difference in management. But I do think one good thing is that most operations were feeding colostrum within the first 2 hours of life. So the same study, this time we asked about colostrum quantity. And so I think this is a really positive message that almost 80% of operations are feeding at least 4 quarts of colostrum, and they're not distinguishing between classes of calves. Um, so I think that's something we can continue to build off of. I will say that, typically in the folks that participate in research or surveys are kind of more progressive, the ones that are already doing really well from a management perspective. And so this might not be the case on every dairy, but for the ones we surveyed, this is what we saw. So now I'm going to talk about some data related to fitness for transport in calves. And when we think about in Canada, I mentioned there's a lot of data out of there. So this study looked at the health of calves prior to them getting on a trailer. And they found that about 40% of calves had at least one abnormal health condition. And the most common that they found in this study was diarrhea. And their average age of calves was 5 days of age, but it ranged from 1 to 54 days. Study we did here in the Western US, we found that over half or almost half of calves had at least one health abnormality prior to shipping. Most of the calves in our study were less than 24 hours of age, and these were non-replacements in both studies. The most common condition that we saw in our study was dehydration, followed by diarrhea. And so this is that survey again, where we asked dairy producers about their management practices relative to calf transport. And so we provided them with a list of conditions, and we said, would you still ship a calf with these conditions? And so 20 to 30% of operations, depending on calf class, said they would still ship a calf with diarrhea. 30 to 40% said they'd still ship a dehydrated calf. Anywhere from about 35% to 55% would still ship a calf with navel inflammation. And then 30 to 40% said they would still ship a calf if it has not received the minimum feeding of colostrum. So unfortunately, we are seeing that some dairies are willing to transport sick calves. And those sick calves have a unique set of needs that's nearly impossible to provide during transportation. And so when we transport sick or injured calves, we're negatively impacting their welfare. Those stressors are worsened and disease conditions can worsen. And not only that, but we see that illness at the source dairy is associated with illness and death at the calf raiser. So if a calf had navel inflammation at the dairy, before they got on that trailer, they were almost 3 times more likely to be treated for diarrhea at that calf raiser. And if they were dull or depressed at the dairy, they were 2.5 times more likely to die at the calf raiser. So we're seeing short and long-term impacts of shipping compromised calves. And so we're making decisions at the dairy that impact the calf not only in that short term, but also in the long term. And so if we want to minimize stress, we've got to do better at making fitness for transport decisions. So now we'll talk about what those calves actually might experience on the trailer. And I talked through this a little bit, but it's worth it to go through it again, I think. So when we think about transported calves, oftentimes they don't have access to milk or water, And like I said, they might experience improper handling. They might have a lack of bedding, they might be exposed to pathogens, they're commingled in extreme weather. And so that can lead to energy depletion in calves. These young calves do not have the energy stores that older animals do. And so stress coupled with increased energy demands to deal with that stress, plus being off of milk for extended periods of time, really can quickly deplete those energy stores. And so we can also see things like electrolyte imbalance, low blood sugar, dehydration. Those calves are going to be hungry and thirsty. They also might experience stress, fear, discomfort, injury, disease, and thermal stress. And so we've got some significant welfare challenges during transport. And so we're asking a calf who's a neonate to overcome these and go on and live a productive life. And so it comes down to management. If we don't manage this correctly, it can be a bottleneck to success in our programs. So now during marketing, again, most of our replacement heifers, we know that they don't go through marketing, although some of them do. But nearly 70% of male dairy calves are sold through auctions. Oftentimes during marketing, they don't have access to milk or water. And they're in new environments with new animals. They might experience a variety of handling techniques, and again, they're commingled. We also know that about 1/3 of these calves are sold more than once. So they're going to go through multiple auction facilities prior to arriving at their destination. A Canadian study looked at the condition of calves arriving to auctions, and they found that 20% of those calves had at least one of the following. So navel disease, which was the most common, eye or nasal discharge, dull or depressed attitude, calves that were unable or unwilling to rise, coughing, and joint inflammation. And then when we look at our calves' condition at arrival to their destination, we know that from a Bob Veal study here in the US, 96% of those calves arriving, so almost all of them, had at least one illness. 82% had at least two illnesses, and those included things like low blood sugar, dehydration, failed transfer of passive immunity, depressed, diarrhea, etc. In the Western US, we looked at calves arriving to a calf ranch, and over half of those calves were dehydrated at arrival. So this was our survey that we did. And so I showed you dairies before. This time I'm showing you calf raising operations. And so we asked calf raisers, in the last year, have you had calves arrive to your operation with these conditions? And so this is showing the proportion of operations. So almost 75% of operations said they had at least some calves arriving with diarrhea. Close to 70% said they had calves arriving with navel inflammation. 60% reported dehydration. 55% reported difficulty breathing. Over half said they had calves arrive with failed transfer of passive immunity. And then followed by respiratory disease, bone fractures, severe lameness, non-ambulatory calves, and extremely thin. And these operations included both calf raisers for non-replacements and heifer raisers for our replacements as well. And so we're seeing data that demonstrates that we have sick or injured calves at each point in the journey, whether it's at the dairy farm, the auction, or their destination. And so transportation is stressful for calves, as we've talked about so far. But this is really exacerbated when we ship calves in suboptimal conditions. And so we have ample opportunities to improve how we manage calves before, during, and after transportation. And so that brings me to the next part of this presentation, which is, well, how do we do that? Okay. I'm going to share 5 strategies to minimize transportation stress. The first 3 include focusing on preconditioning, assessing fitness for transport, and handling calves with care. These are things that within our existing supply chain and calf procurement model, we can and we should do these now. So we'll first talk about preconditioning. So preconditioning is often used in beef cattle industry, but it just means that a set of practices that are intended to help calves succeed in their next phase of production. And so I think if we start thinking about it that way, about how do we precondition these calves, how do we prepare them to succeed um, during and after transportation, I think that will really help us set these calves up for success. So the first one is colostrum, ensuring that every calf, regardless of whether it's a replacement heifer, beef on dairy, or a dairy bull calf, should have access to optimal colostrum. And again, we're aiming to have a large amount of those maternal antibodies present. We also need to make sure that we have some assurances in place on the dairy. If we're sending those calves off, measuring serum total proteins when they get to the calf ranch might be too late. So we've got to have some assurances, some checkpoints in place at the dairy to ensure they get optimal colostrum before they get on the trailer. And again, we want to make sure that we're providing that calf with excellent passive transfer so that we have a higher amount of antibodies that's going to protect that calf at a greater amount, and that our window of susceptibility is going to be shorter and later than if we don't than if we have a calf with poor transfer of passive immunity. The next is navel care. So a lot of that data I showed you, many of those calves were identified with infected navels, and we also saw some long-term impacts of that as well. And so we want to make sure that we're focusing on disinfecting navels and having a clean environment. When we think about that navel, it really acts as a wick. And so anything that's in the environment, that navel is going to kind of take up into the body, and it can go directly to the liver and the bladder and the bloodstream. And that's why we can get calves who are really significantly sick if they have a navel infection. Along with that, we want to make sure that these calves have a clean environment, both in the maternity area, the area that these calves are going to stay in before they get shipped, and on the trailer as well. It won't do any good to, well, I shouldn't say any good, but it defeats the purpose of disinfecting navels if you're going to keep them in a dirty environment. We also want to think about nutritionally preparing that calf for success. So making sure that that calf has a milk feeding as close to transportation as possible to reduce any chances, or to reduce the chances of dehydration and low blood sugar. And then also making sure that calves have access to water, definitely before transportation, during marketing, and then after transportation as well. We also know that milk replacer is going to be better at maintaining hydration levels and blood sugar levels in those calves than electrolytes based on what we know so far. Next is fitness for transport. And so remember, fitness for transport is about the calf's ability to withstand transportation without compromising their welfare. And so we have to start doing this in calves. We know that calves are well prepared for transport when they receive higher quality colostrum in a timely manner, when their navels are disinfected, and when they have access to milk and water. We also know that calves who are a little bit older do better. And I'm going to share some data about that and some nuance around that as well. Calves with the following are not fit for transport. So if they're dehydrated, ill, injured, lethargic, if they have a swollen navel, or if they're unable to stand on their own, we should not be shipping those calves. I really like this quote. This was from a paper in adult cattle, particularly beef cattle, but I think it really summarizes it nicely. Animals least fit for transport suffer the greatest losses in terms of welfare, while market-ready animals in good condition appear to have fewer issues. So we know transportation is stressful. We've got to make sure that we're not adding to that by shipping calves who are not fit for transport. Next is handling calves with care. So going slow and being patient, being gentle like the folks in this picture are doing. Thinking about time of day. So if it's really hot outside, can we ship them during a cooler part of the day and vice versa? Considering the season and the weather temperatures. So if it's really cold out, adding extra bedding that's going to help those calves insulate, potentially calf jackets, making sure they have clean and dry bedding, and then making sure that every calf can lie down. So we know from the recent study that we did here in the Western US, we know that calves are going to spend about 70% of the time on the trailer lying down. And so we've got to make sure that that is clean and comfortable for those calves. And every calf should have adequate space to lie down at the same time. The next two I'm going to talk about for minimizing transportation stress are harder. I recognize that within our existing supply chain. But I think if we are going to be transporting calves, we have to recognize the impacts that age and transport duration have on those animals and consider some things we can do to make it easier on those calves. So this data is talking about the age of calf and the benefits that we see from a research standpoint of shipping calves at a slightly older age. So you can, the first two bullet points are from a Canadian study. And so they looked at 3 different age groups of calves and transported them and then compared health and growth between those age groups. And so when they looked at calves 2 to 6 days of age versus 7 days of age, or older than 7 days of age, I should say, those calves who were at least a week of age had greater average daily gain during the first 50 days at a veal facility and reduced incidence of abnormal respiratory score, meaning they were less likely to get respiratory disease. And when they looked at calves 2 to 6 days of age versus 12 to 19 days of age, those calves who were older had reduced odds of navel inflammation. You'll notice that in those studies, they didn't have any calves less than 2 days of age, which here in the US, we do ship quite a few calves at that age. When we looked at that in our study here in the Western US, compared to calves less than 24 hours, calves who were 1 to 3 days of age had a reduced odds of being dehydrated prior to transport. And so this is easy to say and easy to talk about. It's really hard to implement. But I do want to point out that just one more day at the dairy reduced the odds of dehydration by 5 times. And so we do have data to support that slightly older animals they're able to withstand the stress of transport better than our younger animals. Next is reducing transport duration and events. So calves who were transported 16 hours versus 6 hours had higher levels of dehydration, they lost more weight, and they were more likely to get diarrhea. And that study was in Canada, and a New Zealand study found that for each additional hour in transit, the odds of mortality increased by 1.5 times. Along with this, I think it's also critical for us to think about that distance does not equal duration. And what I mean by that is, for example, we worked with a dairy and a calf ranch in the Western US, and that calf ranch was about 45 minutes away from the dairy. But oftentimes those calves were on the trailer for 8, 9 hours because as they're going around to pick up calves, if they were first on the trailer, they're going to be on that trailer all day. So just something for us to keep in mind that just because it's a 40-minute drive for us doesn't mean it's a 40-minute ride for the calves. Also thinking about direct to destination. So can we explore alternatives to going through marketing facilities, or can we go through fewer marketing facilities, etc.? And finding operations closer to the dairy farm. Those are all things we can think about, again, that are easy to say, harder to implement, but still important for us to consider. And what about a rest period? So again, this study in Canada looked at transporting calves for 16 hours versus transporting them for 8 hours plus an 8-hour rest with 2 milk feedings and then 8 hours in transit. And calves that received a rest period and milk maintained energy and had higher growth, but they spent more time lying the next day. And so we don't know if that is a good thing or a bad thing that they spent more time lying. Overall, it's unclear at this stage if a rest period improves the ability of calves to withstand transport. The benefits might be minimal that we see in this study, but we do definitely need more work in this. So we talked a lot about the last two things I mentioned were age at transport and duration. And other countries have really recognized that that is a challenge for our for calves. And so in the European countries and in Canada, those are really the two things that are regulated. So in Canada, pre-weaned calves can't be transported for longer than 12 hours. And if calves are less than 8 days of age, they have to be loaded and unloaded individually, have ample space to lie down, be segregated from animals that are older than 8 days of age, not be transported to an assembly center or auction, and they can't be reloaded after reaching their final destination. And so just to make you aware that those regulations do exist in other countries. So what do we need to consider about the supply chain? I think our the calf procurement model that we have right now can be challenging. So how can we think about building accountability throughout the supply chain and working together? And I will say that many dairies and calf raisers already work together to benefit the calf. So calf raisers providing feedback to dairies about how their calves are doing, that can be really valuable. I do think there's a bit of a disconnect in the supply chain though. In our survey that we did, we asked dairies and calf raisers, would you be willing to either add or require additional preconditioning practices? And over 80% of dairies and 80% of calf raisers said that they would. But dairies said they would need a minimum premium of $10 a head to implement that. And calf raisers said they'd be willing to pay up to $5 a head. So there's a willingness to implement some practices that could benefit the calf, but perhaps a disconnect in the price. When we asked about challenges, dairies said that their top 3 challenges were labor costs, price of calves when those prices were low, and the space availability for calves in case pickup is delayed. Calf raisers, on the other hand, said that calf health on arrival, the distance from dairies, and calf health during milk feeding phase were the most challenging. So I think, again, we're seeing slightly different challenges that are experienced by different sectors. And so where do we go from here? I think increasing communication and cooperation among the supply chain sectors is going to be critical. Implementing training programs, I think especially around fitness for transport, would be critical. And we want to manage calves to minimize stress. And so, again, if we think about focusing on preconditioning, ensuring we're only shipping fit calves, and handling calves with care, we can do all of those things right now, and we should do all of those things right now. But also recognizing the impacts that age and transport duration have on the calf, and thinking about how we can minimize stress for that calf. And so, again, if we go back to our goals of raising calves, which is calves who are healthy, productive, profitable, and have good welfare, when we don't manage early life stress, including transportation, well, those calves can become sick. And when they're sick, they have reduced performance and welfare. And so, excellent management can reduce stress, and we need to be thinking about how we can set these calves up for success, both in the short term and in the long term. So I just want to acknowledge Erica Machuca, who was a graduate student that did the survey work, my colleagues, Dr. Jessica Pempek, Noah Roman Muniz, and Lily Edwards Calloway, my team at CAF Compass, and then DCHA, UW Extension, and AABP for helping us distribute the survey. And so thank you very much, and I am happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katie. I appreciate that. I really enjoy all the visuals that you have. It really shares the story, but also helps get a lot of context for folks who may have not seen some of those like market depots that calves may have to go through. And I know some folks, it's somebody just comes with a 30-foot trailer and picks up different loads of calves and does exactly what you explained in that picture, kind of bip bops around and then goes to their end location. So, yeah, really appreciate you sharing that. So, any um, any folks watching, please drop your questions in the Q&A. I am gonna throw up a slide here real quick. Um,
I think I might have to stop sharing.
okay.
There you go.
And let's do that. There we go. All right. So if you're able to, please scan that QR code and provide us some feedback on today's session. Once again, we'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, and if you have any ideas for future sessions or future talks on this same topic and opportunities for us to continue to share the word on this very pertinent issue, please let us know. And there's also a URL available if you're able to see that. And I don't have any questions that have come in, so I'll just give it another minute and we'll see what happens.
Sounds good. Everyone's quiet, just like my students in class. And yeah, as Cora said, you can feel free to reach out to me anytime. Email is the best way. And if you have any additional questions or want more information, I'm happy to chat with you.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, I haven't seen any questions come in, so thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your interaction with that survey. And Katie actually hit on a couple of the points that some of the folks shared, talking about average daily gain and overall calf health, thriftiness, and looking at some of the morbidity numbers. So very on point with the topic today. So once again, thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Katie, for joining us today and sharing all of your wonderful wisdom and work.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, have a good rest of your day, everyone.